Now, Democrats tried pushing through a new domestic terrorism bill, but Senate Republicans blocked it, saying it would have been equivalent to creating thought crimes, as they described it. And again, as I just mentioned, the issue, one of the main arguments you have against the whole argument, which I think has just been heavily debunked, that, why do you need guns if the government can protect you, is, well, it takes government too long to respond to protect you. And even then, they might not protect you. Again, the crime will most often have already been committed by the time they get there. That's not really the role they play. If you want them to play that role, you need things like this. And let me explain what this looks like. Now, as they switched the narrative on police to make guns the enemy, they just tried pushing a law that could have labeled police and members of the military, and also you and I, as racists and extremists, and justify the use of things like the Patriot Act and other things to target all of us. Let me show you a couple minutes on this specifically because Senator Rand Paul explains some of the main issues with this. He did a great speech on this.
I've not met one policeman who would not defend their partner, black, white, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. I don't see the kind of sort of insulting rage that the Democrats have for our police. I've met our country's young soldiers and Marines. I don't meet racists. I don't meet white supremacists. I don't meet neo-Nazis. I meet young men and women who are courageous enough to defend our country. And what an insult it is to put a bill before this House that says, oh, somehow our Marines are consumed with white supremacy and neo-Nazism. How insulting. In fact, I don't think you could look at a group of young men and women who are more adapted to the times, who are more accepting of their fellow men, and I have never heard of a Marine say, oh, I'm not going to carry my fallen colleague out because he's African American. I've never heard of an African American Marine say, I'm not going to carry out my fellow Marine because they're white. If there's any kind of grouping in our country more accustomed to treating people because they're your fellow soldier and your friend, it's the military. To insinuate that the military is consumed with white supremacy is an insult. To insinuate that our soldiers are somehow these terrible people, these neo-Nazis and white supremacists, that we're going to get a new government agency to police the Marines. The Marines are a proud part of our military. Our soldiers are a proud part of our country. These are the people who do not see color, who do not see race, who do not see religion. These are the people who don't leave their fallen.
So emphasizing this, what they tried doing was creating these what the Democrats tried doing is creating new branches within our government that would be able to basically target, well, anybody, even including police, even including military, any agency, to enforce this really Maoist, and that's what it is, a Maoist worldview of communist revolution and communist narrative through the lens of race. And they just tried doing that. Let me show you this on this. Epic Times reports Senate Republicans block domestic terror bill, claiming Democrats are creating thought police. It says Senate Republicans on May 26 filibustered controversial House passed legislation designed to combat domestic terrorism. That's the narrative they're using for it. But critics say that the bill is a thinly veiled effort to create thought police for members of the military, law enforcement officers, others. It was a 47-47 vote. Republicans have long been skeptical to efforts by the Democrats to expand the reach of federal intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Chuck Schumer, name coming up again, Democrat of New York. He's a Senate Majority Leader, voted with Republicans actually to filibuster the bill to open up the possibility for reconsideration of the legislation at a later date. So we'll see what happens with that. They called it a Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act that would authorize, this is what it would do, dedicated domestic terrorism officers within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, to analyze and monitor domestic terrorist activity and require the federal government to take steps to prevent domestic terrorism. So this is where we're getting into pre-crime. This is where you're getting into monitoring programs for ideology. This is where you're getting into the things, frankly, which is the direction we're heading into, if people believe that defense is something that's, again, on the government's hands and not a personal issue. And frankly, again, because if you want to have them be a proactive rather than reactive force, you need to have this type of monitoring. This is what it would create. More specifically, the domestic terrorism unit would be responsible to investigate and prosecute incidents of domestic terrorism, as they're calling it, but also this coordinating with the Civil Rights Division on domestic terrorism matters that may also be hate crime incidents. And we've seen how they use the hate crime incidents before, right? Where again, a guy who carried out an attack on more than a dozen people in New York is a black individual, stating his intent to kill white people is not being called domestic terrorism, right? It's used selectively, as we've seen. And further, the bill would establish a new domestic terrorism section within the already existing counterterrorism division of the FBI. The DHS secretary, the attorney general, and the director of the FBI would also be required under the Democrat bill to ensure that each office authorized under this section in their respective agencies shall have not less than one employee dedicated to ensuring compliance with civil rights and civil liberty laws and regulations, and require that all employees undergo annual anti-bias training. Anyone familiar with China and how they do things will know how, psychological manipulation trainings can be used for many different things, right? Brainwashing sessions, essentially, on political views of issues. In addition, the leaders of the DHS and DOJ and the FBI would be required to submit an annual assessment of the domestic terrorism threat posed by white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And they say that specifically, they don't mention other groups, including white supremacists and neo-Nazis infiltrating the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and the uniformed services as they're claiming it to be. The bill would also institute a new training program purportedly designed to root out white supremacists and neo-Nazi infiltration of the military and law enforcement. That's what they were trying to do. That's what was just blocked. It has only been filibustered, meaning it's not over yet. They're going to be trying it again. In fact, that's why Schumer joined with the Republicans to filibuster it, is because he's hoping they're going to redo it. It's not over. Now, they, of course, based that whole argument on the recent Buffalo shooting, where in Buffalo, New York, you had a person go and do, again, a mass shooting. And they said this individual was a white nationalist. And this is an example of white nationalism. They ignored the other shootings that weren't white people. But they said that was all about white nationalism. And frankly, folks, it was an absolute lie. They absolutely lied to you. And then they used the lie they created to use it politically.